Dr. Vahid Wahdat. My name is Parisa Izzatpanahi. I'm the course coordinator of architecture program, Master of Architecture program at Curtin University, and we have had the pleasure of organizing this series of talk. And it's a real pleasure that Vahid could join us today. It should be around 7:30 in Pullman, Washington, where Vahid is located. So we are really grateful for your time. Vahid, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Vahid Wahdat is an assistant professor at Washington State University School of Design and Construction. His primary field of research is the theory of modern architecture with an emphasis on non-Western experience of modernity. He is the author of Occidentalist Perceptions of European Architecture in 19th Century, Persian Travel Diaries, Travels in Farangestan Space. Prior to joining Washington State University, Vahid was a faculty at Texas A&M University and University of Houston. His teaching primarily involves exploration in architectural media, including visual interiorities and filmic expression of space. I'll hand it over to you, Vahid, if you want to have a few words, and then we are looking forward to listening to your talk.
Well, thank you for the invitation and for the introduction, Parisa John. It's a pleasure to be with you guys here. Let me start sharing my screen just to make sure I'm on top of things. Yes, so it's nice to be with you guys from Pullman, Washington, and the series are just amazing. I've looked at some of the previous talks. They're very diverse in the types of people you invite, and the themes that are being discussed, and which makes it hard to live up to this quality that you guys have shown so far. So what I would be talking about today centers around this idea that we know that with the rise of nationalism today, and plus the man-made crises of war, conflict, climate disasters, there is this movement of populations that are seeking refuge and better living conditions. And that's why we see that migration has become such an important issue in today's world. But this flow of people and ideas and technologies, including architectural thought and practice, is not new, and there are histories that show the circulation of architectural ideas. And this is what I discuss in my book, Occidentalist Perceptions of European Architecture in 19th Century Persian Travel Diaries. And I will be talking about some of the ideas that I built in the book here today in this talk, if that's okay with you guys. So, yeah, I'll with that said, what I'll do is I'll do a flash forward to the kind of conclusion that I would like to make. So you guys have a little bit of understanding of what I'm talking about, and then I'll start building the argument so you could see how the logic of this discussion works. So to do that, I'm going to look at this excerpt from Farrokh Khan's travel diary. He wrote this piece back in 1857 when he was visiting London. And he talks about, he starts with Shaddad's paradise is only a sample of this building. It is the flower garden of Eden. And then he keeps talking about these trees and flowers and their branches and, the birds singing and water that's in this place. So when reading this, and there are pages just dedicated to this, and when I was reading this, the poetic tone, the metaphoric language, and the adoption of Persian classical literary style, it brings about this idealized image of a Persian garden into mind. It was with quite surprise that I learned that this description is in fact talking about Joseph Paxton's Crystal Palace. So you can see this icon of modern architecture really is not being described because it was the largest enclosed space of its time. It was not because its innovative use of cast iron structures, nor was it because of the massive use of glass, but rather because it somehow synchronized with this archetype of a Persian garden and this utopian connotation that it has. So kind of see the word Eden here, but the words like Behesh, Rezvan, Janan, all meaning paradise and heavens are repeated 50 times in the book. So, right, like the conclusion that I'm going to make throughout this discussion is this unconscious idealization of physical space that such utopian understanding of the modern world generates. It's really it becomes like a mental journey for these people who are visiting between their self and this pre-imagined utopian destination. So this is kind of a glimpse of what I'm talking about. But what does conventional scholarship, really say about this? Typically, they depict the global circulation of modernity as a one-way transit between the center and the periphery, the original and the copy, which what it means is modernity is by nature a product of Occidental and West rationality. And then Europe is the archetypal model, and any attempt, as one scholar puts it, any attempt to rewrite such a text is, quote unquote, arbitrary and unsystematic copying from Europe. That's why it's typically, they consider non-Western modernities as distorted, deformed, or at least inauthentic. So what I do is I use for the theoretical to theoretically articulate and position my argument, I use the post-colonial theories, which I'm going to explain a little bit. And what I do, I reverse the Orientalist gaze. So according to, and I'm going to explain what this really means. According to Edward Said, he understood that West visioned itself as a center of a power relationship and wanted to construct an imagined other that was colored by exotic fantasies with romantic memories and colonial interests by generating images of this other place, which was, had these haunted landscapes and exotic beings and mystical objects and mythical, sensual scenes and ideas, plus, erotic desires, in order to constitute its own image as a center for reason and rationality and power, right? So what I'm doing is kind of reversing that and asking whether there is a reverse gaze. And you can see this image here, the death of Sardanapal, mid-19th century by Delacroix, which shows all of these, erotic desires and magical memories and sensual scenes that was projected onto this Oriental, quote-unquote, Oriental other. It's, of course, not accurate, but it's really telling more about these desires. So, but the reverse would be, I found this image very interesting. It's this 19th century painting that the Persian painter did in the court of the Qajar called The Mother and Child. It's showing it's now trying to depict a European woman and a child. But again, the opposite is happening. Here again, you see the culturally established aesthetics of feminine beauty. The doe-eyed, round head, stretched, thick brows, small lips, the mole on the cheek, the long black hair, obviously. Plus, it's eroticized again. The subject seductively, half-closed eyes and exposed breasts, and all of this combination is really talking about the fantasies that this local painter had, and it talks more to that rather than the European object of this gaze. And so what I'm suggesting is probably a similar process happens to architecture as well. When people are looking at these, the actual object can be very different from what they expect to see and what they see and bring back as well. So to kind of see this transition of why it's changing between the object and its representation, it's good to look at its route. And what I use for my study, the data, is actually these travel diaries. The travel diaries are, there's a whole tradition of writing travel diaries, but many argue that it's the first modern form of literary writing in Iran, and it's a predecessor to novels. And we know, like, the influence that novels had, for example, in 19th century Europe, where travel fictions become a source of aspiration. We know, for example, Edward Bellamy's Looking Backward and William Morris's News from Nowhere had a great impact on the course of modernization in 19th century Europe. But as my data set, what they do is, first of all, they function as some sort of an MRI that allow me to, see the daily recordings of what is happening. But then also they have this collage-like presentation of information as these snapshot moments that reflect a subjective and really fragmented observations, and most of the times they're very contradictory, because the author do not really seek to twist their observations for a coherent plot, a cohesive narrative, and these types of contradictions really help understand the subjectiveness of the authors. So I look at 4 people, and I call them the Fantastic Four. I'm going to introduce them briefly to you guys. So my first traveler, Abul Hassan, he visited England in 1809, and he stayed for 2 years, and then he returned to England in 1819. This dude was an ambassador. He had a very high self-esteem, a very sensitive guy. He really got annoyed very quickly. And he really, enjoyed this self as an intelligent and cultured person that has traveled a lot. He had traveled a lot. He had a good knowledge of Persian, Hindi, Turkish, English, and Russian. And then he was a pretty funny dude as well. And he saw that wit as a sign of his intelligence. There are a lot of examples, and it becomes kind of central to the discussion of his work as well. But for example, in one occasion, a couple people mistook him for his servants, and he just played along and pretended to be the servants, and it brought up some very interesting and funny kind of moments. Then there is Mirza Saleh, very different from the rest. Saleh was a student, and he went to England to study history, natural philosophy. He also learned English, French, and Latin. His writing is very different. It's very unadorned, and he has this didactic kind of approach. It's like a teacher, and his observations are very objective. He makes sure to refer to multiple sources. He cross-examines all the data that he receives. He's very skeptical with these types of data, and he's got this preference for exact figures and numbers, and so these descriptions are not normative. Nothing is big or small. He just presents you with a number, right? It doesn't make the judgment. And so he's got a very different approach. He published his book in 1820s. An English translation was published in 1824 of the travel account. And then I have Reza Qoli, the guy sitting there, and his two brothers. They were refugees, political refugees. Their father was a rival to the throne, and so they escaped the country and wanted to find some diplomatic means to resolve the issue. He wrote the book and was published. An English translation was first published in 1839, before he even returned back to Iran. His writing style was over elaborate, tons of rhymes and semi-rhymes and metaphors and poetry and Arabic verses, and plus it was very fictive. So he has this obsession with entertainment, which becomes central to his writing, and it's all about his little stories where he and his brothers are located at the center. Of course, very exaggerated, and while pretty fun to read, but hard to believe. And the final person is Farangestan, who was a kind of a foreign minister. He visited Europe for political discussions, had a political mission. He talked with some very great, interesting people at the time: Napoleon III, King Leopold of Belgium, Queen Victoria. And that's why his writing has been much more studied than some of the other ones. But his part of his mission was also to report on the state of progress in Europe. And his book, he intended for his book to be published, but once he came back, he was told by the royal court that he can't do that, and they tell him that this will cause, quote unquote, public awareness, which is not appropriate. So he couldn't publish the book. But nevertheless, you could see that. Now, I talked a little bit about the differences between the people, but there are a couple of things very similar to them. All of them, first of all, joined the Masonic Lodge, which is not something I want to get into right now, but I'll be happy to talk about it in the questions. But mostly the thing that's important is they had this attitude to bring back something. And depending on their, analysis of the conditions of Iran at the time and, their intelligence, you would see that they brought back different stuff. Ilchi brought back a lot of furniture. He enjoyed, having these pieces for himself. And so that was his thing. Mirza Saleh brought back a publishing device with a lot of hardship, and he established the first newspaper in Iran. He took that publishing device, so that was what he was interested in, and of course had enormous transformative power. Reza Gholi, he brought back a water pump, which of course really the whole idea transformed the agriculture in Iran, and modes of production were really, of course, not by this exact model that he brought back, but the whole idea. And Farangestan brought back the camera plus the telegraph system, and he initiated this technology in Iran. But what I'm suggesting by this is that there was this desire to find what's important and bring it back, and maybe the books, these travel memoirs, are also kind of the most important thing that they brought back in the hope to transform the course of the nation and you could see those as kind of a material to reverse engineer modernity in Iran. And of course they were pretty picky about they were very critical of what they would look at, and some of the stuff they would find interesting, and some of the things that they would see were not they wouldn't approve, and we'll talk that a little bit later. So one thing that's very important before we really get into their approaches was that there is this lack of an established vocabulary in most languages at the time when it came to describing space, and that caused a very difficult way of communicating ideas. And plus the other thing is, many of the things that they see, nobody else, their audience have not even seen those. Plus, there's no signifier to refer to them, right? And it makes it very difficult to describe them. So one of the attempts that they would do is just to you know, deconstruct and create new novel concepts from some of the words that they had with new ideas, which I'm not going to get into much. But another method that they used was to refer to some of the common experiences with their audience. So, for example, but I want to tell you how this would create a skewed image, and I'll give you an example. I'm reading this part that they're trying to describe an animal that they saw in the zoo and they were really fascinated about. So they talk about it. They say, you know, there is this animal that's larger than a camel, and it's bigger than an elephant, maybe, and it's got this nice tail that looks like the tail of a horse, and then it's got these funny feet with these little dots on them, and with more on its face. And so, you know, you can imagine that this is creating a very skewed image. And I later learned by reading from one of their companions, Fraser, who was their host, that he mentioned that these folks were really struck with admiration at giraffes. But imagine explaining something that nobody has seen and you don't have words for it, and only your means of communication is text. And you can see how complicated images it can create, and this applies to buildings as well. So when these folks use a vocabulary that is being well established in Persian terminology of architecture, such as Soffe here and Ghulam Gardish, to signify a building that they're seeing, it's going to create an image that is vastly different from what they were trying to explain, in this case, a Greek temple in the Acropolis. So part of the distortion happens in the translation, but some of these methods that they use do not really help. So one of the things that they would use to overcome this absence of a proper vocabulary to evaluate the qualities of space is that they try to instead enrich their records via quantitative assessments. For example, length, height, weight of the objects and spaces that they see, the cost, construction, duration, and so on. But what that does really is it really cannot, it falls short of producing the formal imagery that they want. But what it does, it gives a feeling of precision to the otherwise skewed images that the readers have in their mind, and this measurement really solidifies this imagery with false quantitative authority, if that makes any sense. Right, so there are a couple of concepts that I need to introduce for us to better understand this. And the major thing is Farangestan. So Farangestan literally means the West, and which is again it's got this all-encompassing image of this other that disregards, you know, cultural, historic, and social differences, much like the concept of West that really is very vague and refuses to signify a particular geographic territory, right? And so these guys had an image of this Farangestan. And first of all, it's this other land. It's, you know, it's the other to the self, and that's how it's defined through these, not from outside reference, but more as an alternative to the self. So they had this preconceived image in a binary opposition to Iranian self that they brought with them. And therefore, these travels must be seen mostly as a transition from the imaginary to the real. Now they're seeing the real thing. And of course, they have fluid borders, this West or this other or this Farang. You know, for example, for these travelers who were traveling through the Ottoman Empire, they would consider Istanbul to be part of Farang, but when they really traveled and saw Europe, suddenly it became downgraded and fall off this mental hierarchy of progression. And the same would happen with St. Petersburg for the folks who were traveling through Russia. The other thing is, I really love this image, but through these travels, these travelers were exposed to objects of curiosity. Many of them were just representations of other objects, like art galleries, right? Exhibitions, museums, panoramas, theaters, zoos, botanical gardens, circuses, operas, galleries. They're these institutions that showcase and control body, spirit, history, nature, and present them, right? And of course, these guys were also participating and looking and enjoying. I mentioned the zoo. But then, in fact, in the zoo, something very interesting happened. So zoo is an institution that shows these curious objects, animals that people have not seen, and they were enjoying it. And suddenly they would realize that instead of the animals, people are really looking at them. They're the ones that are objects of curiosity to the European other. There were a couple of instances that Iran was presented, including the Crystal Palace, which there was an exhibition of the Persia kind of pavilion, of course, not very authentic, but nevertheless. And then they could see, how they are becoming part of this exhibitionary culture, and they are attracting curiosity. And in some cases, thousands of people would gather. For example, in Bath, they mentioned that 50,000 people gathered, and I was very, of course, skeptical of this number. But I looked at newspapers of that region at the time, and you would see that there were these kinds of numbers just gathering to see these folks, their beards, their entourage, the people with them, their clothes, and etc. So what would happen is they would sense their selfhood now through European spectatorship, and they would now see their identity as counterpart to these Farangi people, Western people. And that constructed duality of self and other now grew further apart, and thereby it solidified this otherness, right? So there is a whole interesting discussion by Timothy Mitchell about the world as an exhibition, the exhibitionary order of modernity at the time, which is just I'm suggesting for you guys to go and have a look if you're interested. Another thing that's very central to this concept of Farang is that it becomes a wonderland. Abul Hassan, one of the travelers, the ambassador guy, he even calls his book Hayratnam, or the Book of Wonders. And because the image that they see and they try to represent to their audience is kind of knit with oddities and peculiarities, and they enrich it with more mysteries and exotic fantasies, and they seldom try to really demystify that and kind of actively enrich those magical qualities. And one thing that really does not help much is this kind of magical quality that they see, and that I'm going to explain. Let me give you a little example of a story. So you saw Reza Qoli and his brothers who were refugees, and they wanted to meet the royal court in England, but they had to wait for a long time until one day Reza Qoli mentions that his brothers come to him and they tell him that we've been granted permission to visit the king. And so he gets very excited. They put on their best garments and they go out on this carriage, and they stop at this fascinating building. They go inside, and he recognizes some of the royalty, and he sees the king. Everyone is standing there. He goes there. He starts, offering his respects. But then he sees that his brothers burst into laughter. So they did a little prank on him. They took the guy to a wax museum, and he didn't notice, right? And he thought that these are real people. They're pretty accurate, right? And you can understand this. We know that early cinematic devices. People would just run off when they see a train coming in, and they're very believable to people who had not witnessed such a thing. But this is just an instant. There are a lot of these artistic mediums like panoramas, dioramas, photography, even early cinematic devices that create an illusionary nature of representation. And these guys talk about it a lot. They refer to it through miracle, magic, trickery, virtuality, something that comes up a lot. And this adds to this magical quality of Farangestan. So some of these concepts that you see, like the way that describing elevators as rooms that fly like birds, or observatories, or diving bells and ships and balloons and stuff like that, it's not just because they didn't lack the vocabulary to express it, but it's also taking part in this kind of magical quality of Farangestan. And all of these together create this utopian image that they would seek as a source for change back in home. So I'm going to talk about some of the qualities that gain a bit more, that are repeated throughout the travel diaries. For example, largeness, firmness, order, hierarchy, and so on. And I'll use this example to discuss that. So this is an excerpt from Farangestan's diary. So he's traveling now through the sea to go to Marseille in the south of France, and then take a train to go to Paris. On his way, they have a short stop, a one-day stop at Naples in Italy, and they go to see the ruins of Pompeii, right? And so he hasn't seen anything yet. And this is the quote. He's looking at these ruins, and he suggests the layout of the buildings are much like, Iranian architecture. And then at the end, he says, not at all does it resemble the Farangestan design. So it seems that he already has an image, although he hasn't seen the Farangestan design, but he has this preconceived idea that, and we can get hints of it at what they are. So if Iranian buildings are one story, probably Farangi stories are much larger. If they have a central courtyard, you would see the opposite. You would see the building at the center. And if there is this separation between public and private realms in the architecture at his home, what he's expecting to see is a much more erotic version of architecture where there is no separation of men or women, or interior, exterior, or public, private, even if it exists. So, so this is kind of really helps us understand the dynamics of what they see. Plus this image, which I really find interesting. Unfortunately, the travelers that I study do not have anything other than text. They don't have any drawings left. But these drawings happened a couple of decades later when Nasr ad-Din Shah, the first Persian king to visit Europe, started drawing his observations. And you could see here he's drawing this Western or Farangi architecture, and you could see the symbols. First of all, the language of the drawing is much, as you can see, influenced by Persian miniature. At the same time, you can see the plan. You see these little gardens are totally orthogonal, but at the same time, we're seeing the elevation, right? But then you can see there is this grandeur. It's a two-story building. You see these large columns, and then the order, the repetition of these windows, the modules, the columns, and all of that, and of course the pavement. And then there is this hierarchy. There is something at the center, there are sides, and the center is symmetrical again. Parts of the building seem to be much more important than other parts. And there is this combination of interior, exterior. There are windows looking outward, in contrast to, this is kind of a maybe a typical diagram of a building in central Iran at the time, in the hot and arid regions at least. And this is kind of the opposite. It's looking outward, and the whole garden is surrounding the building. So kind of captures these, but I can kind of go through some of these to elaborate them. Yeah, bigness, what Rem Koolhaas calls the ultimate architecture. The magnitude of European buildings was among the first expectations from the Farangi architecture, and one of the most mentioned ones and appreciated qualities in these diaries. And you can see some of these metaphoric languages in describing the grandeur of buildings kind of connotates its utopian, or at least its normative appeal. It's very interesting that when Farouk Khan is talking about an arsenal that he saw in Belgium, he says it was small and it's therefore not worth much attention, and I'm not going to describe it much. So it seems it's one of the main reasons that he would explain a building is their largeness. Now this attention to largeness becomes much more relevant when we learn that upon return, Farouk Khan built his own house, which became the office of the governor of Kashan, in 3 stories, which was quite peculiar at its time. Now, this is another example of, he's quoting someone, a prince of Vienna who supposedly visited the king's palace in London, and he said that I've been visiting this place for 10 years now, and I haven't seen a third of it. So they're trying to envision these fantastical images of what spaces are in Europe. It's very interesting that material gain an inherent kind of value. So some of the materials, such as that are associated with pre-modern architecture of Iran, are associated with this diminutive scale and perceived low value, such as adobe and bricks. But their attention was mostly focused on granite as this magical material that is hard at the same time, but with the things that artists could do, it becomes liquidy, kind of bright, transparent, reflective, and emissive, and soft material at the same time that it's hard, and through that, materials gain kind of an aesthetic. This hardness gains kind of an aesthetic dimension, and firmness really is one of the main components of their discussions. Occupies a central place in the discussions, and part of it is because of the military outlook that many of these have. Many of these were administrative figures, and at the time Iran was engaged in a very important war with Russia, and so they're like interested in forts and castles and these thick, large walls. Very hyper-masculine appreciation for visual firmness rather than actual firmness. But later they develop a more nuanced understanding. They start discussing bridges. We'd have these new, there were these new bridges at the time. The Iron Bridge, you guys are familiar with in London, and they talk about the span of these arches and the vaults and the construction speed. So they develop a much more sophisticated understanding of firmness. Now, another idea that becomes very important, as I said, is order, and they become obsessed with it, and they mention every moment of order that they see, and it gains a kind of an aesthetic dimension as well. They have this idea that everything is intelligently planned, rigorously regulated, and meticulously implemented, kind of like how Krakauer describes mass ornament, but may not be that relevant right now. What happens is that this is kind of a pathological approach for them. This is what they seek, what they find missing in their original nation, and therefore that's their solution to everything, and that's why they see it a lot. They mention it every time. They assume that this order has some sort of a top-down kind of process of implementation, and therefore this regulatory order seems to them to be state-mandated, and that's what they want. Their administrative folks, and they have ties, they're elites, and they rather see these to be something that should be implemented by the state. And we can see that in Farouk Khan keeps mentioning a speech that he heard from Napoleon III, plus he talked with Haussmann and he saw these the type of urban regulations that he had in Paris, and was very fascinated by this kind of top-down approach. So maybe the one of the final things that I want to talk about is I want to talk about two more things. One is this kind of hierarchy that they would see. Everything that they saw, they would assume that it's symmetrical, even if they weren't. So they describe buildings as if they're symmetrical, where they really we see the plans and they're not. But then also this hierarchy applies to societal status. They see some sort of a power relationship through building. They see, there is a location for the king. There is this higher. So for example, in London's, you can see Farouk Khan talks about this administrative building that he saw, where the below rooms were designated for administrators, and then the directors, they occupied a better space. Or in London, apartments, Mirza Saleh saw that the servants had a different hierarchy of space compared to the other people, and they really enjoyed that. They had this higher social status in their own country, and they wanted to see a modernity that they wanted to bring back as something that would keep that kind of social status, and we'll talk a little bit more about it later. The other fascinating thing was they also developed positions, for example, on ornament, which are kind of consistent throughout these travel diaries. Now, and I'm showing you two quotes from different travelers. One of them is Farouk Khan, and he's talking about why he sees England to be much greater than the other nations in Europe. And he talks about, he mentions a couple of things, but suddenly, he says their ornaments are simple. It's like, before 50 years before Adolf Loos, they kind of come to this conclusion that ornaments are distractions. You could see Mirza Saleh also talks about handwriting and how it's not important in England, and calligraphy, which is an esteemed art in Iran, is considered is not being appreciated, and he analyzes it, and by suggesting that maybe because they consider it to be a waste of time and useless, right? This concept of use and utilitarian rationality here shows that take parts in this idea of ornament. All right, so I've got a couple of minutes. Let me just finalize by saying that the travel memoirs for my study in the book were not necessarily important because of what they suggest, but also because some of the stuff that they don't mention. Now, I know that these travelers were pretty frank, and they did not, they were very critical. I've seen moments that they criticize someone's poetry. They tell them that it sucks, we hate it, or about the food, they're very opinionated, and about a lot of other issues, including architecture. So Ilchi, for example, found the plan of English houses to be deficient in ground space and much too small. Or Farouk Khan didn't like the proportions of the Westminster Chapel, and he found it not to be beautiful, which is a building by Christopher Wren. But you would see suddenly that they stop mentioning some stuff. For example, we know that they were living, they were occupying London. They all see London and Manchester and Lille, some of these highly industrial cities that were overpopulated, highly polluted, and with high traffic. And then you would see that there's no mention of it. In fact, how they present these cities is as if it's this vast, large garden. London is this vast, large garden. Everyone is just enjoying their time, drinking wine and playing music, and there is no So in the diary, for example, Razali mentions that there is absolutely no sign of smoke and steam, but in private, he says, I'm choked, I can't breathe, I hate it here, and he took every chance that he could to get out of the this kind of space. All right, so now some of these ideas that I mentioned come from culturally established spatial ideas that these travelers had. Some of them were really pathological. They looked at spatial qualities that they lacked at home, and they wanted to find, discover those and mention those. And some of it really comes from their elitist background. We know very little about the servants that were with them, but from these descriptions, they had a totally different understanding of European architecture, which I'll be happy to explain the questions. The other important thing to consider is that these folks, these three travelers, or four travelers that I mentioned, plus some of their other travelers that I don't mention here, and a few other people at the same time, with like three major English hosts that they had, and they were all totally connected. They all knew one another, they interacted, they read their stuff, and they created a discourse, if you will, which means that their image, this image that they present of Farangestan and this modernity that they want to bring back, finds its authenticity not through external references, but through internally kind of repeating and cross-referencing one another. That's how it solidifies its image, and it becomes very central. So I dedicate a full chapter about that. Folks who came back, most of them participated in some sort of directly in some sort of an architectural construction, but indirectly their writings were read vastly and inspired people, especially in the royal court. Abul Hassan made his house. It doesn't remain. We don't have any signs of it, but people kept kind of talking about it. So I found some information about it, how it was a hybrid of what he saw plus the traditions of architecture in Iran. Reza Ghali is suggested to be one of the patrons of a mosque, which is highly questionable. But Farrokh Khan became a governor. He built his office that I talked about briefly. He was in charge when he was the governor of Tehran. He paved the city. Plus, he built this bazaar in Tehran. His house, as I said, was very large. But then this bazaar typology, just the fact that he was interested in a commercial typology, and he found it very interesting. And this is the building that he commissioned, which is well known, but you can see it's extending the traditions of architecture from its previous era, but also very different, and I'll be happy to discuss this. So thank you. It was really, I enjoyed talking about this, and I'll be happy to answer questions. I'm just showing two images on my last slide, kind of for you guys to kind of see what's going on. This is, on the left, you see a Persian miniature painting in Chelsea Palace, I think from back in 14th, 15th century maybe. On the right, you would see one of, again, Nasruddin Shah's paintings. I've misspelled the dude's name. Anyway, painting that he did in Europe. You can see the theme is completely the same, but you can see the backdrop of an architecture which kind of shows all of this. It's multi-story, it's large, it's very firm. It's got this hierarchical procession to it. It's on these staircases and symmetrical, and some parts seem to be much more important. The image is totally pastoral. The garden takes much more importance than the building. Very regulated. You see the kind of order, and plus very extroverted and erotic, if you will. All right, I'll stop my screen sharing and.
Okay. Thank you, Vahid. Come in, Annette. Sorry, I'm just inviting Annette to my office. That was a fantastic talk with a different angle that I personally have never, looked at this. Coming from same background, I think it was a quite interesting angle. You looked at the Persian diaries, so thank you so much. I have a question, but I let Annette to ask her question first, and we have a few more questions through the chat box, which I can read out later. Okay, Annette.
Okay. Hi, well, thanks for a great talk. I've been really interested in the notion of luxury in the West, and what's particularly interesting is how I ended off. Well, when I talk about luxury in terms of this idea about the sybarite, because sybaritism, which was all about living excessively, was quite prominent in the 19th century. And what I found through my own research in southern Italy and Calabria, which was the place where it was a lot of the ancient Greeks, rich ancient Greeks, settled in Sybaris, the actual town. This is 5th century BC. And what was interesting, what I found was a very ornate capital, which was originally from Persia. So the Persians had traded with the Sybarites, centuries ago. And then this term cybaritism was quite popular in the 19th century. So I'm just wondering, when you talk about when the worlds collide, what was happening in Persia, I mean, so many other things were happening, like in Egypt. You had the archaeological digs in Egypt, the Ottoman Empire. So there were all these kinds of otherworldly cultures and influences happening. So what I'm asking you is, where are you going to go from now? Like, are you going to expand this research so that it encompasses these other Arabic cultures and Persian and extend it? I just want to know where are we going to go from here as far as this research? But it's quite interesting, this kind of counterpoint between the Persian influences in southern Italy. This is like 5th century BC, and then it was cut off after the Saracens.
Right.
Invaded southern Italy and Sicily, the Arabic Empire, ruling Sicily for 200 years. I mean, so much was going on, but there's just a lot we don't know.
No, you're right. You're absolutely right, and I appreciate the question. And I wish I had known about this or been more conscious about it or more attentive to it before. Now that you're mentioning, I don't really mention much. Now that you're talking about it, there are moments that come to my mind that can really help to talk about this excessiveness, this luxurious types of lifestyles. And first of all, I want to emphasize that if I'm giving this impression that these travelers create a very homogeneous image, it's not the case, and they're somewhat different. So, for example, Ilchi, Abul Hassan, he seemed to be very interested in this type of life. He mentions them, although I remember that he visits the house of Sergor Osli, who's a very major Orientalist figure. And he sees all these paintings. And he finds them absolutely excessive. And when he learns about their price, he's like, who the hell would pay for so much for such, not so elegant, let's say, paintings. But then he brings a lot of furniture back, and everyone who visited his house in Iran would suggest that it was very different in the excessive amount of stuff that he had. But otherwise, for example, Mirza Saleh, who was the student, he lived very differently from the rest. He was really a different breed because he was not part of the royalty. He would have to work, so he worked and he worked for free as well because he wanted to learn, the whole industry of publishing, and he didn't take part in these parties that were often available to them because they were Persian princes and an object of gaze. And you saw also when it came to ornament, they didn't really approve that much ornament. In fact, it's very interesting that the beginning of their travel, especially for those who started to travel in Iran, where they're mentioning some of the sites that they saw in Iran, there is this appreciation of ornament, materials, gold and silver and emerald. They become very important. But later on, when they see Europe, they don't mention any of those. It's only granite and the simplicity of it and this effect that it creates. I hope this kind of somewhat addresses your
Yeah, and there's
discussion.
also the influences of the satraps in Venice as well. I mean, if you look at the architecture of, I think it was Cadario as well, there's a lot of, I'm pretty sure they're Persian details, a lot of the ornamentation, marble, dining like a satrap, which came from Persia. So there's all these references which I found when I was doing my own research about luxury and the influences of the Sybarites, that kind of morals, so to speak, and a lot of writings that the French were doing in the 19th century, 20th century, maybe even earlier, was through this Persian influence in Florence, in Venice. So I think it's quite interesting, and then I think there's a lot of research to be done in those areas.
And I agree,
Yeah.
It's an interesting point, a very important one, and of course a good way to expand the current discussion and research.
Mm-hmm. And I love those images you showed of the Persian interpretation of a European palace. I thought that was
aren't they amazing?
Unusual.
Yeah, they're... Thank you for the questions.
Thanks, Annette, and thanks, Vahid, for the response. We have one more question from Azim. It was a very interesting topic. Vahid, do you know of any similar researchers that have done the reverse, like studying the foreign explorers who traveled to Persia and the way they looked at the built environment?
Right. So, in fact, you would probably find more research. There's a whole tradition, first of all, of the grand tours and, people getting interested in what's happening in this quote-unquote Orient where there's a lot of much more material. Like, I was having a hard time finding cases to look at the time. There are like, maybe 20 cases. The specific time that I'm looking at, there's not that many more. There's only one that is written by a female author. But when you look at the reverse, like the amount of literature that is coming from the other way, like, people visiting Iran and writing about it, it's just so much, and it's much more diverse, and the studies are much more diverse. But when talking about this study of travel diaries became kind of significant, especially Iranian travel diaries became a bit more significant in the past couple of, maybe past 2 decades. And there are a couple of good works. There is one by Mohammad Parvar who looks at travel diaries. Some of them are the same ones that I looked at. There is Niall Green who did a good work, and he also studied a couple of these travelers that I did. There is Muhammad Tawakkuli Targhi also did a fascinating work called Refashioning Iran, I think, and he's got a couple of chapters on these similar dialects. He does explain Mirza Saleh's as well. And there is Naghma Sohrabi also was maybe the latest that conducted research on some of the same travel diaries.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Vahid. I guess I'm going to ask the last question myself, if no one else has any question. Obviously, lots of thank yous and commendations on the chat box that Vahid can read later on. I guess my question is related to what you are currently doing, because I've been following, the works you've been doing with your students in Washington State University, right. And I'm just trying to connect what you have just described and you explored in your book to your current work. So the space we live in these days, and teaching our students, architecture students, incorporating lots of virtual reality and basically twisting images of the reality. So is there any actual association between your research and your book and the way you teach, are you actually trying to replicate the same false image or fake utopia? And what is the value? If the answer is yes.
This is a good question and a hard one. I'm gonna share here in the chat a link to what Parisa is mentioning, so you can kind of have a glimpse of what's going on. There are two things that are yes, there are two things that are very similar in this type of research that I conducted and showed you here, and also the type of work that I do in my studios. Which it took me a while as well to see that. First of all, there is this appreciation of utopian speculations. We know that after the failure of some of the socialist nations to kind of implement their ideas, there was this backlash towards any type of utopian speculation, right? And especially with Popper, we would see that as well, that he kind of theorized this kind of disinterest in utopia, and they would suggest that it would inevitably fail. But today we have a different understanding. Like it's in fact something that I think designers should really be conscious of. We need to be able to suggest alternative environments, but also alternative ways of living, and what, for example, Zizek suggested, we have these two pills, and we need to find a third pill, something utopian, and thereby be able to imagine an alternative to this, our hyper-capitalist societies. I think it's very important. So there is that utopian aspect, but then there is also my interest in media. So I'm interested in media. So travel diaries, for me, functioned as a media. I wanted to see how they twist this image and how they contribute to it and how they actively take part, and they have agency, and they're not these passive, objective things, right? But so other media are also very exciting to me. You can see, some of these experimentations with. I do a lot of VR, I do some AR, I do older stuff, stereoscopic images, lenticular images. I like film. So anything that really relates to media is also something that I enjoy working with. So photography, film, and all of that. Plus, there's that utopian aspect, and you can see it's in some of this type of work my students are doing. But yes, I can understand also why it appears to be very distant and different as well.
Thank you so much. I am just trying to share. I think everyone can see my screen. I shared my screen so participants can see a few images of, I guess, your students' works. These are really fascinating. Annette and I are quite enjoying watching them. It's just really great, Vahid. Thank you so much for sharing all these great works with us and your research. We deeply enjoyed the talk, and we have recorded the talk. I'm pretty sure we can basically use this as one of our lectures in our future theory culture units, definitely. Again, thank you so much for your time. We are conscious of time over there. It should be night time, and again, thanks.
No, thank you guys for your invitation, and all of you who really attended this, and I enjoyed, meeting you all.
Perfect. Thanks. See you then. Cheers. Bye. Okay, lots of thank you messages. Thanks everyone for attending. Next ArchiTalk will be next week by Adrian Finney. You should have received the invites, but it will be Wednesday. Please join us if you can. See you then. Cheers.